Hey y'all, it's your friendly neighborhood pod pastor, MaKendree Van Hall, once again here to talk about spirituality and faith deconstruction, theology, politics, and everything in between. Thanks so much for coming out today. I had a plan about how things were going to go, and once again, those plans were thwarted just by life because I was having a good time last night for Halloween with my friends and family at our church-owned brewery, Greater Purpose Brewing Company. You can look that up. It's a fun little project we've got going on, and at one point, my friend brought up that they had been in an email exchange with a mutual friend of ours concerning what made me transition from being a progressive Christian to an atheistic agnostic. And if you listen to the entirety of my podcast since I started it, I think I've been leaving adequate little breadcrumbs that kind of lead you down the path that I traversed there. However, there are dozens of episodes of Rev'dUp, and like many of you, I am also extremely limited on free time, so I think what would be beneficial for you and for me is to give you the pamphlet version of how MaKendree became an atheistic agnostic. And to be clear, I'm not going to go all the way back and discuss my exodus from evangelical Christianity into progressive Christianity, okay? That is a separate journey riddled with its own interesting plot twist. And in fact, the first half of that specific journey is available in my book, Reborn Again, Crucifying Christendom and Resurrecting a Radical. It is under my dead name, Christopher Van Hall, but you can find that on Amazon or anywhere books are available. Today's podcast is about how I took that journey from becoming a progressive Christian and kind of exploring new realms of thought in progressive Christianity and taking a giant leap further and letting go of God entirely. So I want to give you the rundown of how that occurred. So a couple years ago, I met our friend who's been featured on this podcast quite often, Dr. Bernie, who is a pantheist Christian atheist. Actually, I'm sorry, pantheistic Christian atheist. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but Bernie basically believes that life itself is spiritual. Bernie follows the ethical teachings in the Gospels concerning social justice and caring for the poor, but Bernie believes that ultimately there is no God or afterlife. Now, at the time, I'd never heard of such a thing. I mean, it was mind-blowing, and at the time, if I'm being fully transparent, I assumed that I was going to restore Bernie's faith with my own modern and science-embracing and inclusive take on the scriptures. Little did I know that Bernie would ultimately be solely responsible for making me an atheist years later. Now, Dr. Bernie and I would have many conversations as our relationship grew and as we began to hang out more after services, and I would quickly learn that Bernie is a brilliant and wonderful resource for this breadth of knowledge concerning all things within the realm of historical, institutional, religious events and how their scriptures were canonized. So Bernie invited me into this world of biblical scholarship with the likes of Bart Ehrman, Elaine Pagels, Christine Hayes, and Dale Martin, and just began giving me all of this information to consume. And these authors were some of the best I have ever read, and they compiled some of the most detailed scholarly materials concerning the origin of the scriptures that I have ever witnessed. The last nail in the coffin for me theologically was going through the Hebrew Bible course curriculum from Yale University. That's free online. You can actually look at this on YouTube. Christine Hayes is a brilliant professor. And in this class, Professor Hayes taught that the God of the Hebrew Bible had many names, and not for the reasons I was taught in Christian churches. It wasn't because God was so far beyond our finite understandings of who God is and how complex this being was that one name could not encapsulate the entirety of this deity. God had multiple names because the Hebrew Bible is composed of 4 different sources. You've got the Yahwist, the Elohist, the priestly, and the Deuteronomic sources that all make up the Hebrew Bible. And in these different names for God is a history that's totally disconnected from one another because these were different gods entirely. And then the text was edited to make it appear as if these sources were referring to the same God, but this explains why much of the Bible is filled with so many contradictions. Because these verses aren't talking about the same God, and these verses aren't trying to correlate with one another because there was no canonized scripture at that time. Now, as time went on, the more I learned about the origins of my faith, I gotta tell you, the more visceral I became regarding Christianity, and not just evangelical Christianity. I come to terms with that dumpster fire years ago. The more I learned about the history of my faith and the composition of Scripture, the more I began to loathe progressive Christianity too. Now, why do I say that? Because many of these ministers that are in the progressive Christian world, they learned about these very things in seminary and refused to discuss it from their pulpits. I had been a progressive Christian for 12 years, since I was 25 years old. And so much of my life was devoted to sacrificing my energy and denying natural urges so I could spend more time in ministry and get closer to God. And I spent countless hours in the servitude of the God that I thought was depicted in the text, and to be confronted with the reality that not only is there not even a consistent message in the Scriptures, but there is multiple gods as well. There's not even a consistent God in the Bible. I just gotta, you know what? I gotta tap out, guys. And the only conclusion that makes sense to me as to why this information is not being disseminated in progressive congregations and in their pulpits is because their congregants would likely abandon the faith too. Or perhaps these former seminarians just want their congregations to live at peace with one another. And the knowledge that this information would ultimately cause division in their church and cause an uproar within their communities is just too much to bear. And can I just say that both of those reasons are just fucking terrible excuses for intentionally hiding the truth from your congregants? They deserve to know. Do you think for 1 second that I would have devoted every weekend to an institution based on blatant inconsistencies that were blended together with an imperial agenda in order to maintain power during that empire's unjust occupation? No! I would have left. I would have tapped out. I would have been done. Down for the count. Outie Girl Scouty. That would have been me. I would have devoted my life to going back to school so I could serve people that were in need, or starting a business and trying to work in some type of ethical approach to doing said business. But instead, the truth was hidden from me, and my illusions of a predestined divine purpose remained, and I continued to nurture religious institutions. This week, in the middle of a liberal amount of resentment, which is not uncommon right now, I'm going through this deconstruction process. If you're doing that too, you've probably felt these same sensations of anger and frustration. But I found this morsel of comfort, and it was so comforting that I even posted it on Facebook. I said, the most healing realization in my faith deconstruction journey is the knowledge that God didn't ignore my pleas for divine intervention, because God was indifferent to my pain or the world's pain or my suffering or the suffering of the world, but rather God's silence was a byproduct of God's non-existence. Now, this post actually gained an overwhelming amount of positive responses, but some of these replies were extremely rude or inconsiderate. And don't worry, I'm not going to mention names online. I'm going to keep names confidential, but the comments were public, so I want to unpack these troubling statements because they've been bothering me for a few days. One person said in response to my post, I do believe in God. I have too many experiences to suggest otherwise. And my pushback to that is this, and I don't think this person meant this rude, but it did bother me a little bit. Like, what are those experiences? And most importantly, are those experiences based in sensation or emotion? I'm just throwing that out there. You know, what are these experiences? Because often when people say, oh, I've had an experience with God, it's based in a feeling or coincidence. Another person said, yeah, I stopped believing in God because I cannot make God do what I want to. And they meant this sarcastically, and they meant it in a rude manner. And look, honestly, I don't know this gentleman other than he is a quote unquote progressive minister, but with all due disrespect, fuck you. Hypothetically, if God did exist and me in my finite and sinful mind can understand that children starving to death around the world is wrong, and there is this hypothetical all-powerful God of the universe that could eliminate suffering with a thought, and that God still chooses not to end this injustice, then that God is not worthy of my worship and would deserve my opposition. However, if suffering and crimes against humanity and indifference are not being abolished by God because God is a figment of our imagination, then that is far more palatable than a deity of indifference. My statement was not rooted in arrogance, sir. It's birthed from reason. And it would be nice if this wasn't such a rarity. I'm not the smartest person in the room. I'm just the one that's being willing to examine the evidence. Half the time, it's mind-numbingly infuriating. Another person said, MaKendree, your conclusions may require more research. Research for 20 years led me to this conclusion, Haas. Next. All right, moving on. Check, please. And finally, one person said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You know what? Perhaps. I'll give you that. However, if I told you to wear an invisible parachute that you can only perceive with emotion and that you should jump out of an airplane wearing this invisible parachute that you can only feel with your emotions and with chills in the room and just trust that it exists and pull it at the right time and it's going to work, would you jump? There is clearly absence of evidence in this metaphor. You would have to trust that I'm giving you a functional invisible parachute. But using the logic that you stated, that doesn't mean that the parachute doesn't exist, right? So why would you be afraid to jump? So I ask again, would you jump? No, you wouldn't. Nobody in their right mind would jump. So why the hell are we devoting the only life we're going to get to a God that has given us zero bupkis evidence that they actually exist? Especially when there is mountains of scholarly evidence suggesting that they do not. I want you all to be free from the shackles of religious baggage that robbed me of the best years of my youth. So go forth and see the divine in your neighbor's eye, witness the wonder of sacred earth that bathes the landscape in splendor, and take in each holy moment as if it was your last, without the bondage of religion. Until next week, grace and peace to you.